When the Tomb Raider Remastered trilogy was released with a disclaimer from Crystal Dynamics, there were many who said it wasn't a big deal. They seemed annoyed by some of us who took offense at it. They said it was a trivial piece of PR that didn't mean anything. Crystal didn't hate the original Tomb Raider games. They weren't calling the former developers at Core Design racists. They claimed we were blowing the whole thing out of proportion. Content farming fake outrage for attention. But now we've gotten some additional information about the Tomb Raider tabletop RPG that's in development, and well, I for one am feeling a little vindicated. I've talked about Tomb Raider more than once in my videos. One, because it's still one of my all-time favorite video games, but also because of the news we keep getting about the utter bastardization of this franchise at the hands of Crystal Dynamics, and now Evil Hat Productions. It's the latter one I want to focus on here. From the first announcement of Evil Hat's licensed TTRPG, Tomb Raider Shadows of Truth, there have been all sorts of red flags that this game would be a tortured misrepresentation of Lara Croft and Tomb Raider. And now we have another big piece of evidence. A draft of the guidebook for Shadows of Truth apparently contains a disclaimer talking about Tomb Raider's problematic history with colonialism. The disclaimer begins by asking, what then is raiding, and how does it mirror colonial practices? Now let's stop right there, because I can already see how Evil Hat is going to play a semantic game of sophistry here. And since they asked the question, what is raiding? Let's start with that first. According to Merriam-Webster's dictionary, raid has a few different definitions, such as a hostile or predatory incursion, a surprise attack by a small force, a brief foray outside one's usual sphere, a sudden invasion by officers of the law. For the most part, the term raiding has to do with a forceful incursion by a person or group into another area, often as an attack with the intent on taking something. But how does Evil Hat use the word? The disclaimer continues. Raiding as depicted by the original Tomb Raider games and stories involves going into ancient tombs and historical sites of different civilizations to acquire artifacts. It operates on the assumption of finders keepers, that grants raiders with the means and the drive to claim ownership of artifacts, regardless of whether they have any historical or cultural claim to the treasure. While this part of the statement is true, that raiding tombs and historical sites absolutely implies the theft of artifacts, that is not always the case in the Tomb Raider games. In the first Tomb Raider game, Lara is hired by a woman named Jacqueline Natla to recover an artifact from the tomb of Qualopec. As the game unfolds, you learn that the artifact is the key to Atlantis, and Natla is the last remaining ruler of Atlantis. So you can reasonably make the argument that the artifact actually belongs to her, and Lara is not stealing it. At least not until Natla double-crosses her, driving Lara to respond in kind. The third game involves the search for meteorite fragments that, according to the lore, have changed hands and been possessed by many different groups over the centuries, which means they have no natural origin or official ownership. So as you can see, Evil Hat's already twisting the facts a bit so they can force them into the narrative they're trying to build. Continuing with the disclaimer, they say, later games released in the franchise have started the work of addressing this by having Lara acknowledge her past mistakes, and trying to understand and show respect for the cultures and communities she comes into contact with. Now I don't know what they're talking about here. In the most recent reboot trilogy by Crystal Dynamics, Lara shows very little consideration for her actions. In the first game, Lara is presented as a survivor, willing to trample and destroy whatever she has to save herself and her friends from the island where they become shipwrecked. Her fascination and respect with the historical sites takes a distant back seat to the violence-heavy action the game throws at the player. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, Lara is driven to prove her father's theories are true, while trying to beat a sinister paramilitary cult to an artifact, placing an entire village of people in harm's way in the process. Though Lara acts guilty about it later, she does very little to make up for what she's done. And in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, Lara's ambition, again driven by competition with this same cult group, goes after an artifact, and incidentally triggers the Mayan apocalypse. The rest of the game sees Lara attempt to save the world from her own actions. And again, though she spouts some verbal references to her guilt, her actions are about as conceited and self-centered as you can imagine. None of it shows Lara acknowledging her past mistakes or respecting the cultures and communities she comes in contact with. So now that Evil Hat has misrepresented the previous Tomb Raider games, we get to see where their manipulations are leading by claiming that Lara has worked to reform Raider culture and raised awareness of her peers. Lara no longer decorates her mantle with mythic artifacts. As a raider, she prioritizes seeking out the truth. Remember the definition of raiding we looked at earlier? None of them had anything to do with seeking out truth. Finding a historical site and artifacts, only to learn from them and respect them, is not raiding. But just as Evil Hat thinks they can simply change Lara Croft's character and personality, they think they can simply change the definition of words too. And you might be asking why. Why would they attempt to do this? Well, because as we've seen, the current rights holders of Tomb Raider do not like the franchise's origins. They don't like the past depictions of Lara Croft, and they've taken it upon themselves to correct what they see as the series' past transgressions. Evil Hat says that their game is inspired by Lara's humanity, her struggle with heroism, and her tenacity. They are cherry-picking specific character traits that they can reframe and use as important components in creating a game that celebrates history and culture, while acknowledging and respecting the work required to live in a world wounded by colonialism. And if you think this is just coming from Evil Hat Productions and people like Ray Najati, who professes to making her games proudly post-colonial, well, think again. At the end of the disclaimer, Evil Hat says they will work alongside Crystal Dynamics in creating a sandbox for you to tell stories that address colonialist themes. Evil Hat is working with Crystal Dynamics side by side and hand in hand. Crystal gave Evil Hat the license, knowing full well the type of game they intended to make. This rebranding of Lara Croft and the Tomb Raider franchise is being done with their full support and approval. So what does that mean for the video games going forward? After this, it's hard to imagine them putting out another game in line with the originals. They may not depart as widely as the Evil Hat game seemingly will, but they dare not depict something they've been so publicly against. My guess is that they will try to straddle the fence, offering up things they think fans of the original will like, while continuing to subvert the series with their own agenda, to impose current dayisms into a world that should be purely fiction. All of this nonsense around colonialism and harmful stereotypes is the product of modern politics and fanatical anti-Western philosophies that cause people to read themselves and their own prejudices into everything they interact with. While Evil Hat are very open about their intent on taking Tomb Raider and recreating it in their own image, I don't think Crystal even understands what defined the original games or what people liked about them, so any effort to appeal to that group will be destined to fail. And unfortunately, this is who is currently in charge of Tomb Raider. So aside from the remastered trilogy, the future of the franchise is grim, unless Embracer wisens up and hands off the license to a different developer who might just be able to do the franchise justice. But remember, this is all just one rebel's opinion. What do you think? Do you have any interest in Evil Hat's Shadows of Truth? Do you think there's any hope for the future of Tomb Raider? Let me know in the comments below. If you like this commentary, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you'll get all the latest commentary and analysis right here on Rebel Normal.